har nu då en viktigt ämne och en debatt eller samtal som vi har att se fram emot. Det är någonting som också är ganska komplicerat. Det kallas DSA och DMA och kanske har några av er hört om den här förkortningen, medan andra är kanske djupt insatta i allt vad det handlar om. Oavsett förkunskap så kommer det här samtalet vara viktigt. Förkortningarna är då en del av ett förslag som EU-kommissionen publicerade den 15 december. DSA står för Digital Service Act och DMA står för Digital Markets Act. Och det här kommer både eventuellt ställa till det, men förhoppningsvis allra mest göra saker bättre och tydligare i framtiden när om de blir lagar. Framförallt är det viktigt att förstå vad det kan betyda och vad det kan innebära. Rubriken för den här panelen handlar om yttrandefrihet i en digital tid och om EUs försök att reglera nätjättarna, om det är rätt väg framåt. Och vi har en panel som ska tala om detta. Jag ska direkt bjuda in dem och presentera dem. Alla är med på länk, så jag säger först hej och välkommen till Anette Novak. Hej, ska vi se mute-knappen, den förrädiska.
Tack för det, Emanuel.
Ja, du är ju generaldirektör på Statens medieråd. Du har en lång bakgrund inom både journalistiska medier och utredningar och myndigheter och så vidare. Roligt att du är här. Du sitter i Stockholm kanske?
Sitter i Stockholm.
Mm. Och sen så har vi Daniel Westman. Är du med oss också? Juristen som är specialiserad på media och IT-rätt, vilket kanske är... Ja, du är ju specialiserad på väldigt mycket mer och är ju engagerad i en rad olika debatter som handlar om det här. Är det korrekt sammanfattat?
Ja, det får vi säga. Trevligt att ses.
Fint. Innan jag presenterar nästa deltagare så ska jag också berätta att detta samtal kommer att ske på engelska eftersom nästa gäst inte talar svenska, men är inte desto mindre viktig för det samtalet som vi ska ha. So, hello, Jan Penfrat. Are you with us as well? Yes.
Yes, hello, everybody.
Hello, you're a senior policy advisor on EDRi, European Digital Rights. And where are you right now?
I'm based in Brussels.
In Brussels, okay. So we are connected from all over the world. And Jan, you will also start with a short presentation about the DMA and the DSA before we will discuss this further with the panel. So please take the stage.
Thank you. I'll quickly try to share my screen. Let's see if that works. That would allow me to have I hope that is working now. Can you see the slide?
Slide is working fine. Could you please turn on your camera again?
Yep. Just trying to make sure the slide fits on here. And my camera, sorry about that. Here we go. All right, I've been asked to talk about, and that is the wrong slide. My apologies. Just way too many slides around here. So while I search for the right slides, I'm just going to start talking already. So I've been asked to talk about the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Both important pieces of legislation that have been proposed on the EU level. And I want to spend a brief minute explaining why these two laws are necessary and why they are proposed now, just to set the context right. And then I'll speak 1 minute about, or 2 minutes about, what the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act bring, what is new in them as compared to the situation in which we are now. And now I have finally found the right presentation, which I will share. And switch on my camera again, make this full screen. Here we go. Okay, so the DSA and the DMA, what are they and why do they matter? So first of all, why legislating the digital market now? I mean, the digital market isn't new, it has been around for a while now. Why is new legislation necessary now? And I think the first thing I think to take in mind is that the number of companies that work in digital now, and the type of companies that we see, the type of digital services that is offered has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. And I say 20 years not because the internet has an age of 20 years, it's much older, of course, but because the current legislative framework of the European Union on the digital markets, and specifically on online platforms, dates back to the year 2000. It has been negotiated in the 90s, which is a time in which none of the big tech companies, and that's not entirely true because Microsoft has been around, Apple has been around, but Facebook, Google, TikTok, YouTube, WhatsApp, none of these companies have been around when that legislation was passed, but yet those are still the rules under which we live today. And we live in a world, in a digital world, which is entirely different to what we had back then. And I want to not be too technical here, but when the internet was invented basically, and then rolled out in the 90s to the general public, and become that commercial and communication space that it is today. Initially, the internet was a decentralized space in which every user was an equal node, and every user had the possibility to and did share content on their own websites, on small forums, and this decentralized nature is what made the internet what it was back then. But that has changed over time, and now we see that large parts of the internet and of the online activity that we see is hosted by what I call the big tech platforms, and they share. They basically are responsible for the way that we share content, and they don't always take that responsibility the way they should. And I've just put up a couple of headlines here that you may have seen in the press, where companies channel advertising into problematic ways, where people are silenced on online platforms because of what they have been saying, and also where content is fed to users in a way that pushes us into certain directions but omits other types of content. So big tech platforms have become much more than content carriers. They are content moderators today and curators, and they decide in a way, in a lot of ways, the type of content that people see and the type of things that people can say online. And I think this is kind of important to keep in mind in the background. And if I talk about big tech companies, I talk about really big, and I guess you all know that how much money and influence is behind those big companies. But this just to show this a little bit, a graph from the UK Furman report, which tries to show the dominance that some of the biggest players have achieved in online search, for example, that's Google and Bing, mobile operating systems, iOS from Apple and Android from Google, social media, Facebook and Snapchat, digital advertising, they took Google and Facebook as an example, and showed the market share, how that has developed. And you can see we're talking about almost complete control of most of those markets by the big tech players, and that obviously gives those players a large influence over the digital sphere. So this is kind of the setup in which the EU has decided to bring up the two new laws, the DSA and the DMA. Just to say, okay, what's wrong with dominant platforms? It's a little bit, obviously a tendency here in that question, and I already said how much that controls people's digital lives, but there's also, platforms that are centralized constitute a single point of failure and a single point of pressure by government. If I speak failure, think of data protection failure, for example. We just had huge breaches on Facebook, but also on LinkedIn, and we have regular kind of news about these kind of data protection breaches, pressures by governments. Think of Apple banning certain apps from the App Store under the pressure of the Chinese government, for example. But it also brings a monoculture of content moderation rules, and I think this is a crucial piece in the puzzle which the Commission is trying to solve with more or less success. We will debate that later. Because if we look at how content moderation works today, the only point of reference that we have is this small handful of companies, and we somehow have to trust them that they actually do whatever they can to moderate content properly, without us having an actual way to check if that's true. And it's a lack of choice for users if you only have a handful of platforms out there. Right, but I'm not supposed to talk about that. I'm actually supposed to talk about what the DSA and the DMA propose. What do they actually do? And I try to kind of make this as short as possible. It is really hard because it's big laws. We're talking 80 pages of legal text for each of them, plus recitals. It's a lot of legal text and a lot of new rules in there, which will apply to different kind of online intermediaries and online platforms in different stages, to different degrees, depending on their size and their market position. We'll get into that in a minute. So what's the difference between the two laws? So the Digital Services Act, on the one hand, is a law which is supposed to modernize existing rules for what the Commission calls online intermediaries. So those companies who sit in the middle between different types of users, business users, end users, but also different end users. And so they provide the digital infrastructure for interchanging communications or information. At the moment, these intermediaries are regulated by the e-commerce directive, which dates, as I said, back to the year 2000. And so the Digital Services Act has the aim of modernizing this law and amending it with new rules. And if I say modernizing, the modernization is mostly about the liability rules. So the question, when does an intermediary become liable for content that has been provided by third parties, by users, basically? So user-generated content. So that could be YouTube sitting in the middle and being liable potentially for people's videos that they upload. It could be your internet service provider being liable for the emails that you send back and forth, or for Dropbox being liable for the files that are hosted on their servers. So this is kind of the first question. But the DSA goes further than that and introduces what the Commission calls a notice and action system, a mandatory notice system for illegal content. So the possibility for users, anybody really, to notify a platform about potentially illegal content. And so here we need to be really careful, because just because someone has flagged something as potentially illegal doesn't mean that it is actually illegal. In fact, from similar laws in other countries, we know that the number of fails notices that platforms receive is substantial. So we need to be really careful about how we apply this kind of notice system. The Digital Services Act also proposes an out-of-court dispute settlement system for users, which I believe is a really smart idea. The goal is to lower the barrier of entry for people to actually fight for their rights. Let's say if you tweet something on Twitter and then Twitter removes this and says, sorry, this is illegal, or this, we won't carry that, and you think that decision is wrong, most people wouldn't go to court over a tweet. We can't afford it. We don't know how to. So having a dispute settlement mechanism that has a lower barrier of entry for people to go and to basically ask for their rights, to be heard on those platforms, I think is a smart move. This obviously should be paid for by platforms and not by users. And these dispute settlement mechanisms need to be independent in order to be trustworthy for everybody. The Digital Services Act also introduces due diligence obligations for platforms, for very large online platforms, and there is a definition in the law about what a very large online platform is. It's not quite clear what the due diligence is, but the Commission's idea is to say, if you are very large, you need to do annual risk assessments about what kind of risks your type of platform carries, and how you mitigate those risks. It's a little bit of a fluffy article, but it's in there. It's certainly not a bad idea, but I would love this to be sharpened to make sure that cannot be abused to bully platforms into certain behavior without having that actually written into law. Right now, the last bullet that I have on this slide for the DSA is crossed out because it's not in the DSA. I realize it's not a perfect representation of this, but the DSA does not propose, unfortunately, any limitations for what I call surveillance, or others call as well surveillance advertising. So advertising that is based on the constant surveillance of users and the gathering of their personal data. Those limitations, I believe, are necessary because this is what the business model of most platforms is. And surveillance advertising is also what creates a number of incentives for platforms to push certain content over other. And so I believe content moderation and content curation shouldn't be driven by those commercial considerations around surveillance advertising by platforms, but should be driven by the needs of users, what they need, and obviously by the health of our public debate and the health of our democracies. We can talk about this in discussion later. I think it's an important point. Now, I don't have so many minutes left, so I want to focus on the Digital Markets Act very quickly. And say what the DMA does is different. How is that different from the DSA? So the Digital Markets Act is already very different in scope, while the DSA focuses on all kinds of online intermediaries and online platforms, and applies to basically all of them. The Digital Markets Act only applies to digital so-called gatekeepers. So companies who have such a dominant position in their market and a position which allows them to control the gates, to control the access to a given market. Think of Amazon controlling the market, to trade goods, or think of Apple controlling the access through the App Store to basically all iPhone users. This is just an example. So there is a good definition of gatekeepers in the DMA. And so what the DMA does is that it introduces a whole list of do's and don'ts onto gatekeepers. It's a very long list, so I can't go through all of them. But these are things like a gatekeeper is not allowed to share data across services. So as an example, under this rule, Google wouldn't be allowed to share to use personal data that they collect from Google Maps and kind of use that to show ads on, let's say, Gmail or Google Search. That's kind of one of the rules that are in there at the moment. And one is you have to allow other app stores on devices if you're a gatekeeper. So under this rule, Apple would be forced to allow third-party app stores on iPhones, something which I believe would be really good for users. There is a little caveat and limitation to this rule in the DMA, unfortunately, but this is a minor detail. So there's a long list of rules, do's and don'ts in the DMA. And the goal really is to impose structural behavioral changes on gatekeepers to make sure that not only, hey, you have to to do this and that, and otherwise you pay a fine. No, really, it's about making sure that there is real change in how gatekeepers behave. Now, unfortunately, the DMA only focuses on what is called business users. So if you're a commercial user, if you sell something as a commercial entity on Amazon, then the DMA applies to you. If you are a third-party payment service provider and you want to provide a payment service on on iPhones, for example, then the DMA applies to you. The DMA does not apply to end users, and that I think is a real pity, because the DMA is supposed to be an extension to existing competition law, and existing competition law is all about consumer welfare. And so if this is about consumer welfare, why do we only look at business users and not at end users? And so as a result, the DMA empowers not people, but mostly empowers business users. And as an extension, it improves the situation for business users, but it doesn't question or let alone change the dominant position that existing gatekeepers have already today. So their position is very much untouched in a way in the markets that they already dominate. So this is kind of the difference. So the Digital Markets Act really comes from a competition angle, looks at what kind of conduct is supposed to be allowed or should not be allowed. The big modernization here is that, different from traditional competition law, the Commission doesn't have to prove that there is harm happening to people. First, it is assumed that if you're a gatekeeper and this is your conduct on the market, then that automatically has a risk of creating harm, and so you need to change your behavior. This is the big novelty in the DMA. There's a lot of people who say this isn't enough and there should be more powers for the Commission, and I think there are good arguments for that. You can certainly tweak and improve the list of do's and don'ts, that's for sure. But all in all, I think it's a worthwhile thing to do, and I'm very glad that both those proposals are on the table. But yes, there's definitely space for improvement. Now, I lost a little bit of view on the time. I don't know how much time I've left at the moment, but let me just quickly come to the conclusion here. As a kind of a result of this, I think it's definitely worth making sure that the DSA and the DMA don't only scratch the surface and try to kind of mitigate a little bit kind of the damages that big tech companies are doing at the moment. They need to go to the heart of the problem, which is the business model. Go after the ad-driven platforms that have the commercial incentive to favor divisive and scandalizing content. Break up the opaquely personalized platforms, make sure that there is no space to finance disinformation and election interference, and thirdly, break up the walled gardens, because this is what locks in users onto centralized platforms rather than being free to choose the platform that you want to be on in the end. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to look forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Jan Penfrat. Interesting presentation. I want to bring in Daniel Westman first and just let you comment on what we've just seen. What do you are you concerned about these two acts? What are your thoughts?
I agree. It sounds like with Jan that this is a good start. It's I've been quite nervous before this presentation, because when you hear the rhetoric from the political side and so on regulating big tech, and also talking about very easy solution to solve everything, I think that's you could get quite scared. So what we have seen here, I think, is a rather balanced solution. There are definitely room for improvements in various areas, of course, but you could fear, for example, that you would have a legislation throwing out the users' freedom of speech, freedom of information in order to regulate the tech, and that would be a pity, of course. And we're still not there. So there are a lot of member states and also other people trying to push this proposal in a direction that is quite dangerous. So I think this, as Jan said, this is a good start, and there are room for improvements. This is a very complicated area with different. Every solution has its drawbacks that you must also look at. So when you find something that you think is easy solution, you have to think harder. So it's a very delicate balance between different interests here. And of course, as Jan also mentioned, it's a very big proposal with the proposals in very different areas, and of course it's also a complicated relationship to also existing and other type of coming legislation. For example, the GDPR when it comes to data protection. I think maybe I disagree a little bit with Jan there. There is a lot of room already in the GDPR to solve these basic problems when it comes to the surveillance problems, but you need more enforcement and so on. But we have already, I think, the legislation we need in that area if we have a greater enforcement. But that's a topic of discussion, of course. But not everything that comes is about big tech needs to be regulated in these two proposals. There are other laws, of course, already existing and also coming laws that could handle this area.
It seems like a lot with these two big acts coming at the same time. Why is that? Why is it coming at the same time? I don't know if Daniel or Jan want to answer that. Jan, please.
I think it makes sense because there's quite some overlap. Like if you look at what the DSA wants to achieve, it's focusing on how big tech platforms apply their power to moderate speech, online speech, and what kind of responsibilities they should carry for online speech. And this, I think, is impacted by the dominance position that they have. So it's a big difference if I say something that is potentially illegal on Facebook and can broadcast this to 3 billion other users, or if I say it on a local forum, where there are 10 other people reading it. So that makes a big difference. So the responsibility part is intricate, is regulated in the DSA, but it's intricately linked to the dominance questions that are tried to be solved by the DMA. So I think it makes sense to bring those together.
It needs to come together, right? I'm going to let you reply if you want later on, Daniel Westman, but I will also want to invite Anette Novak into the discussion, Director General, Swedish Media Council. And I'm just curious, what are your impressions or thoughts after hearing Jan Penfrat, Anette?
Well, it is a complex area. It is a first initiative to try and bind together all these complexity in these two acts. So I totally agree with what's been said earlier, that this is a first step. And it's been said that the US exports tech and Europe exports legislation. And I think we must realize that this is a world first. I think a lot of people are agreeing on what we want to achieve. But when you go into the intricacies of lawmaking, you realize how extremely difficult it is to both for the pinpoint the definitions. Even now, this is a much more complex definition apparatus than we have had earlier, I believe. And still, a lot of the consultancy replies that have come in so far, this is where it's criticized, that it's not enough detailed, because, I mean, if you say Google, it's one of those, how they call them the very large platforms, but Google in itself has so many business areas. Should search and Waze be regulated the same way? It's not even, I mean, they're not in the same business. So it's even more complex than I think we sometimes realize. And to make law, to make a really clear law, it's going to be a long process.
I know you, Anette, as a Director General, cannot have an opinion about the legislation piece, but the frame for this discussion now is: do we need regulation at all? And what is your opinion on that? Do we need to regulate big tech?
Absolutely, I think this is a good initiative. If you look at the purpose, from my position, I mean, the Swedish Media Council, we're tasked to protect minors from harmful media influences, and of course there are lots of harmful media influences out there on all the platforms, and today's legislation and regulation is not enough. So the aim of creating a safer digital space, I mean, that's very valuable. Then there's the how. Is this the right way? Will this actually achieve a safer digital space, or will we create new problems? That's an open question. And as a civil servant, I don't think I should review the politicians' initiative, but I'm happy to discuss what we need, because we also need to create greater awareness on media literacy and all these harms that we've been discussing that Jan has highlighted. This is something we need to both at growing up, but also as adults trying to create safer space for kids. We need online. We need to be aware that these challenges and these risks exist, so we can counter them and forward awareness.
Daniel, Anette said that the US or the America export platforms and the EU exports regulation. Is it inevitable that a regulation needed to be in place And what are your thoughts on the regulation? On overall?
You can say that you need to evaluate and reassess the legislation, of course, but there is no legal vacuum today. It's already regulation in place, but then the discussion is how is it adequate for the problems that we see today, and I agree that we have some new problems that needs to be addressed. But as I said earlier, you need to be very careful, because the US has a very much the hands-off approach, and that's a way to protect freedom of speech, of course, because if you have the states or the EU going in very closely with these companies, regulate and have agencies saying what to do and not to do, it's dangerous, of course, from a freedom of speech. But it's also necessary to protect freedom of speech and fundamental rights. So it's a very delicate situation. To do nothing, the full hands-off approach is not good for fundamental rights, but it's also very delicate to when you try to go in, and especially when it comes to the relationship between the Commission in this proposal, a DSA proposal, and the relationship between the Commission and these very large platforms. I see a danger that with these kind of vague rules, it could be used with heavy fines in order to try the very big platforms to move in a direction that the political system wants. So it's also a lot of dangers here. But to do nothing is not the solution. Then you must have smart regulation, and it must be legal certainty, and it cannot be as vague as the proposal we see today. I think in some respect it must be sharpened, as the previous speaker has said also.
But you still feel that these acts are kind of fine. You're kind of hopeful, or I don't know what words to use, but what are you worried about? What corners needs to be turned, or what turns are you afraid that will be done? It's a long process before this act is taken and made a legislation in Sweden. What are you worried about? What could happen?
One fear I think is that what's not in the proposal is, for example, a regulation of harmful content. That has been a discussion also. Regulation of disinformation, harmful content. We have seen that kind of development in other areas, other countries, where governments use this discussion about fake news and so on to impose very vague requirements on platforms. But basically this is a regulation of people's speech, but they do it through regulating the platforms. So that is the danger here. You need to do something and to keep the platforms accountable. But the easy solution, for example, that is proposed by some people is why don't you make these platforms liable for everything, and make them see them as a newspaper or something like that? Wouldn't that solve the problem? Then they will be liable and they create a safe environment. But that, of course, would be very dangerous for the users' freedom of speech and the possibility to use this platform for all the good things. So this is what I mean with this delicate balance, to do the right thing and do it and try to balance the different legal fundamental rights. And I think that this is a good start there, but you need to be careful during this process, what will be proposed for kind of change.
Jan Penfrat, it's still early on, right? This needs to be past Parliament and the Council, and then a trilogue, and then the Parliament again. It's a long process, of course. But speaking to the audience that's here in Sweden now, working with what we do, what do you believe we should be, on the lookout for?
I think I think the aspect that Daniel just mentioned, the impact that the two laws will have on fundamental rights, I think that's really the thing you should be looking out for, because as he said, trying to push the big platforms to do more to somehow protect people on the internet is way too vague as a policy goal. But that's something that's very popular. And let me just give a quick example. I spoke about the notice and action system, right? So the obligation for platforms to allow people to flag potentially illegal content. Now, the general rule is, and according to the DSA proposal, will be in the future, that a platform is not legally liable for user-generated content unless the platform has what is called actual knowledge. So they know about the illegality of that content, all right? So that continues to be the case under the DSA proposal, but there is a loophole, which basically says, as soon as a platform receives a notification through the notice and action system from any user, anybody who thinks anything could be illegal, then that constitutes actual knowledge, and potentially the platform is liable. What's the result? The result is, if you're a platform such as Facebook, you will receive likely millions of notifications a week, which are complex legal assessments, each single one of them. And so the only commercially, rational decision for a platform that size is to say, well, as soon as I get one of those notifications, I have the liability risk. That's a business risk. Let's do away with that risk. How do we do it? We remove the content. So I call this the delete first, think later approach. And that's what the Commission proposes. It's really a pity, because they try to hold them accountable, the platforms, but the result will be people's speech will be suppressed. And that's a pity. It doesn't have to be that way. Yes, they need to be more responsible, the platforms, but not by holding them liable for user-generated content, because that is such a blunt tool, such a hammer for a very intricate speech problem. It will most certainly lead to over-removal, and I think for people in Sweden that would be really a problem as well, because as most people in Europe, Swedes don't have a real choice on which platform they want to go, because there is only so many platforms available.
Anette Novak, what are you on the lookout for with this process of legislation?
Well, I don't totally agree with what Jan said right now, because I think there is many provisions in these texts on having to argue for why they remove content and things like that. So it's more detailed and more information to the user. But the way the way it's been written, there's also difficulty in for instance, it says that the platform has to inform the user with arguing on why something was removed. And this, of course, if we're talking, and going into my area, if we're talking child pornography, for instance, and we have a police ring moving in on a child pornography ring, we do not maybe want the platform to inform them, because it might hinder the police investigation. So these things are very complex. I think that just to round it up, I think one thing that I think is very important to understand is also that the platforms we see today that we're trying to regulate, they could be taken over by other forces than the ones in charge of them today. And it's the same also with the member states, that a regulation shaped one way would function very well in a country where Big Brother is for freedom of expression, for media freedom, and function very negatively, even backlash against the citizens in a country where Big Brother is hostile towards free media. So I think that type of complexity also needs to be catered for in the next version, and I think we will see iterations in this text.
Thank you, Anette. We're kind of out of time, but I just want to check, or actually we are out of time. So and I see that there's not been a lot of questions as of yet as well. But I think we're all realizing that this is a very complex topic, and the acts and the legislation pieces as well. And I'm very sure that we will hear more from it, and perhaps also from you. And I just want to thank you all, the three of you, Anette, Daniel, and Jan. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us a better idea of what this is all about. Thank you.